welcome back to Exodus Brothers. This is episode 3, Deconstruction and Healing, and I'm Micah and Knapp.
And I'm Jake Knapp.
Thanks again for joining us.
So just to recap briefly on the previous episodes, in the first episode we talked about our upbringing in evangelical Christianity, being raised in sort of an insular Christian bubble, and some of the challenges that came with that. And then the last episode we broke down some of the myths behind the miracles and talked a little bit about the Bible and some of the ways that the Bible gets things historically, scientifically, or morally incorrect. So with that, we're going to get into our personal journey of deconstruction and then ultimately our path to healing. So obviously, deconstructing is a difficult thing. There's a lot of emotional and mental challenges that are faced. When you start deconstructing your beliefs, especially when you're raised with beliefs that are sort of indoctrinated and that are really ingrained because you've never been able to question those beliefs, it feels like you're losing a part of your personal identity when you start to deconstruct those beliefs. So there's a lot of negative emotions and things that can arise during that process. Things like anxiety, loss of identity, end of community, feelings of guilt and shame, anger and betrayal, fear of judgment, conflicting beliefs, and even overthinking and self-doubt. But at the end of it all, there's a lot of benefits. And for me personally, my deconstruction journey was a very gradual thing. I didn't wake up one day and say, I don't like Christianity anymore. I've been hurt by a bunch of people and I'm angry at God and I think I'm just going to become an angry atheist. It was a slow, gradual process, and it involved a lot of deep thought, reflection, and critical thinking. And ultimately, it wasn't just the people that did harmful things, people that were not very Christian in their behavior, but it was ultimately reading the Bible and deciding that it didn't add up for me. As far as an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God, I just couldn't reconcile a lot of the stuff that was in it.
Yeah, I had a very similar journey myself, and I was just curious how old you were when you first started to deconstruct, just the beginning, because I know it's a long process.
Right. So I would say the catalyst for my deconstruction was when I attended YWAM DTS. I was 18. That was a situation where there was a lot of cult-like dynamics. I guess I would describe it as, at the very least, it was a destructive, authoritarian organization. There were a lot of people that used God told me to control and manipulate people. And that made me realize that there was a lot of people projecting their own wants and desires for God onto other people. And they did that to control. And I realized it didn't seem like this was God. It seemed like this is just people trying to control other people. So it took a long time to even come to grasps with everything that happened in that 6-month period. And I realized later down the road, there was a lot more damage that occurred than initially when I first got out, like when I really started thinking about it. So that was really what kickstarted me questioning my faith and going down the road of deconstruction. There was a lot of cognitive dissonance that I still had. There was things that I had decided that I didn't really agree with or believe in anymore, but I still wanted to believe in God. Growing up, I was told that God wanted a personal relationship with me, but even after decades of trying to talk or pray or connect with God, I never really got any signs that he was there, let alone that he wanted a relationship with me. So it felt like this one-sided relationship. And I feel like if God was all-knowing, he would know what it would take to convince me that he's real. But really, so far, I feel like he has not done that. I feel like he's remained divinely hidden. I think one of the big challenges with deconstructing is that people can gaslight you, saying that, if you never heard God or never got answers, or maybe it was because you weren't praying hard enough, or maybe you weren't trying hard enough, or maybe you weren't even a true Christian, the no true Scotsman fallacy. But it's not just other people that can gaslight you. There was also a lot of self-gaslighting and guilt and shame and questioning and wondering if, what if hell really is real and I've made a mistake and now I'm going to be punished for eternity. So there's a lot of lingering stuff there. But that was the beginning of it for me. And then it took many, many years. I would say from that point, it took me another 10 years easily before I really got to the point where I was like, I can't continue to believe that this stuff is true. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. I shared a very similar process. It's obviously a slow, gradual process, like you said, over time. But actually, I was the same age too, about 18, when I started questioning things. Obviously, the subsequent years following that, or maybe even 17. And in high school, I remember I was a big cinephile. So for me, it was actually movies for me, documentaries primarily. They got me to start to question my political and religious worldviews. And it just kind of opened myself up to other stories. And that's, movies are an empathy machine. And so films are putting you in the place of the characters. And so from there, like there was a couple of films that changed my life that I watched that changed my opinions on my beliefs. But also I joined a couple internet message boards. And on those message boards, they were like political and religious subjects. And I went on there just to kind of challenge people. And then once I started hearing my own opinions back at me, it started to make me realize how silly they all were. And so, yeah, it took years. It took, over the course of a while, and just didn't feel right to me. When I was old enough, I realized I had never really believed in it for myself at all, actually, the more I thought about it. It was just something we'd kind of gone along with and been taught. And so you just kind of fall into that without really questioning or thinking for yourself, actually, at all. And it caused a lot of anxiety for me, as I talked about in the first episode. It was kind of a chaotic world that didn't make a lot of sense. And it was constantly being involved in sort of cult-like scenarios and these environments that were more damaging than they were helpful. But again, watching films like Schindler's List about, the genocide of a people, or learning about racism and, The Color Purple, or I think it was even a Christian Disney film called The Perfect Harmony. That one ingrained in me just sort of that, how scary racism was. Or films like The Elephant Man that are teaching you about, mistreating somebody just because of the way they look. So I feel like films taught me more empathy than church and religion ever really did. And we were always taught that the secular world was a scary place full of sex, drugs, and sin. And there was this spiritual warfare taking place. But when you come out of religion, I feel like you realize it's actually the opposite, that's the scary place with the bad people. And you were always taught that there were bad people outside of that, but you just really come to realize it was more so inside the church circle.
Yeah. In retrospect, a lot of my biggest traumas happened within the insular bubble of religion and being protected from the quote unquote secular world. And then once you get into the secular world, you realize, yeah, it's messed up. The world's messed up, but it has nothing to do with the fact that it's secular and that it's somehow worse than anything else.
It's a typical cult trapping where they, it's the insular bubble thing that you mentioned, that when you're inside of it, everything else is bad. But once you break out of that bubble, you realize, the bubble is really bad. And that's the toxic place. It's kind of like the Matrix, the red pill, blue pill thing.
And the fear of the unknown, of not, thinking the world's this big, scary place. And so that, anybody that doesn't think like you or look like you is, potentially a bad person. Letting go of rigid beliefs also sort of creates like this, it ignites like a curiosity, and it encourages you to like want to grow and create and creative expression, all that kind of stuff, artistic expression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, creativity and art, I feel like saved me a lot of times. And even doing this podcast or making art along the way, it's kind of how you would deal with, it's like your way of processing it. And we would make movies together as kids. And if you watch back now, you can kind of see that a lot of them had to do with, coping with what we were going through. But it just really flips your world upside down when you deconstruct and question your faith. You're questioning your entire existence and everything you've come to know your whole life. And I think questioning things in general is a good thing. It's good to question authority or the government, your church, your beliefs. Blindly following something is bad. There's no growth if you don't question. But if you did in church, you were often ostracized or shamed.
Mm.
And so you were kind of scared into not questioning. At least that was my experience.
Yeah, for sure. And it goes back to what we talked about before. A lot of people are just born and raised in a particular religion, and it's often the religion of the country that they're from or the religion that their parents adhered to. And so it's like a tradition almost, like you're handing it down and you're teaching your kids the way that you were taught religion. And a lot of people, that's the way the Bible is presented to them. They don't necessarily sit down and read the Bible for themselves. They get lessons at church and they hear what their pastor has to say about it, and it's just one person's sort of take on it. And so you're getting a very filtered version of the Bible, and it's easy to cherry pick and talk about some nice stories, but then you miss all the other things that are problematic. So it's important to like not just accept what anybody else says, but when you start questioning it and looking at it and reading it for yourself, I think that's when you can get some better insights.
Yeah, and there's also just so much we missed out on. We weren't taught a lot about science or evolution. Well, evolution at all. Obviously, it was kind of laughed at and mocked. But creationism and sort of anti-intellectual viewpoint and pop culture you're missing out on. So you feel like you feel like you're disconnected from the rest of the world and from reality and from everyone you know. And that's a way to control people. If they're cut off from the world outside of them, they don't have a way to get away from it as easily.
Yeah, there's a lot of catch-up that we had to do with in regards to just general knowledge and learning. And since deconstructing, like I have a desire to learn and continue learning new things and growing. and not just accepting things at face value. I want to do a deep dive. I'm interested in the truth, and if there's things that are problematic, like with religion and with the Bible, I want to acknowledge those things and not just pretend like they didn't happen or gloss over them. And so it sparked a curiosity in me that I want to continue learning, and I'm very fascinated with philosophy and metaphysics and all that kind of stuff. Life in general, pondering life, and the whole part of it. It's interesting and it's exciting, and it doesn't have to be a big, scary place.
Yeah, and actually, I don't know how you feel. I feel like I'm okay with not knowing, actually, and I'm fine with a little mystery. I think it's good to normalize saying that we don't know the answer to something.
Right.
But we can learn the answer, and over time we can learn something. We might not know the scientific reason why something is the way it is now, but that you can learn it at some point down the line.
Yeah.
And then we know why that thing operates the way it does, or why we have rainbows in the sky. It's not because God promised he wasn't going to flood the earth again.
Yeah, we can demonstrate it with physics. Ultimately, I think God as a concept, God is an unfalsifiable concept. You can't prove or disprove it. In fact, you can't even demonstrate that God exists. There's no meaningful way other than personal experience. I had, people that have religious experiences say that it's God, but there's not any real meaningful way to demonstrate that God exists or what God wants or any of that stuff. And so rather than saying, I don't know when it comes to something, anytime you insert God in there, the God of the gaps, you're creating a lot more issues and a lot more questions. And I know that people want to have answers, like they want to have answers for some of the most important things, like why are we here? What's the purpose of life? And what's the meaning? And I want to feel like I have a meaningful life and I want to contribute. But I feel like you're able to do that. There's many meaningful ways that you can contribute and be a good person and be compassionate and empathetic and want others to live their best life without the need for a dogma or God.
Yeah, well said. I 100% agree with that. I feel like also a lot of Christians, they either haven't actually really read the whole Bible and they don't actually know. They just kind of know snippets that they can spout out, and they're not paying attention to the details of what God is actually saying in certain chapters of the Bible that we find problematic. God seems to be a flip-flopper. We talked about how God feels regret after the flood. God shouldn't change over time if he's this infallible, all-knowing,
morally perfect being.
Exactly. And so we talked about this in the last episode. Why was he pro-slavery? And now Christians would argue he's not now, obviously, because we're not now. But God himself is not only promoting slavery, but condoning it and killing and wiping out innocent people, which isn't very pro-life. He's barbaric. And honestly, if someone were to tell me this story, I would think that God was evil.
It sounds like if you were to take the God from the Bible, it would fit a villain in almost any story if you were just to read it.
Exactly.
And so it's incredibly problematic, and especially for God that's supposed to be all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing. And there's philosophical arguments you could make too about how that's even possible to be all three of those without it being mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. The only real explanation that people can give is that we have free will, and even that could be argued. There's even a good case that we do not have free will, and there are over 20,000 people that die every day of starvation. A lot of them are children under the age of 5. And the fact that goes on, and you just chalk it up as, well, there's free will, so that's why there's so much suffering. And yet this God knows that the suffering is going on and is all loving, so he'd want to do something about it, and is all powerful, so he could do something about it, but yet doesn't intervene. And then at the same time, that God will help you find your car keys if you pray.
Right. All the small things, right? For some...
The little things that are not significant. The idea that God will somehow answer my prayer because I'm special, but doesn't answer the prayers of a starving child. And that just doesn't sit right with me.
Me either. And it's like, okay, so that God, he doesn't help all the kids that have, what's happening in Gaza right now or whatever. But he's hanging out on football Sunday, choosing sides with what team he wants to win.
Helping people score touchdowns, baby.
Yeah, that's right. But I feel like God is a reflection of the time and place culturally and the minds of the humans who wrote it.
Yeah.
It would be more evidence or proof to me, for example, if, back when the Bible was written, culturally slavery was okay then, but if God came out against it back then, that would actually convince me a little bit more than the fact that he went along with it. All these cultural customs that were happening at the time, i.e. sacrificing animals, all these barbaric things that we can look at now and say, these are awful. Why would he be in support of them?
Even if you take it back a step, a God that chooses favorites, favorite people, favorite groups. He has certain people in the Bible that are favored amongst others.
Yes.
That he sort of treats like his favorite child. Even just that concept of choosing groups over other groups doesn't seem in line with the being who's morally perfect and good.
Exactly. And again, though, it makes sense when you look at historically and in context that the Israelites at the time were being killed off in great numbers and they were having a difficult time, and that most other groups of people believed in multiple gods. And so the Israelites had to create their one powerful God that could be, was on their side and could, help them defeat the enemy.
My God can beat up your God.
Exactly. That makes more sense to understand why they might have come up with this particular God and why he was on their side.
Yeah, there's a lot of the Bible that I think is just humans putting their own wants, needs, and desires on and saying that it was God. It's like today when you hear people in certain groups that, God laid it on my heart to convey a message to you. And I'm like, well, why didn't God just tell me directly? So, people claiming to hear the voice of God, that's already a red flag for me. I don't think that it's possible. At least it's not possible that in my experience. And it's funny how people use that as a way to rationalize what God told them. And yet usually it's in line with what they would want to do.
Yeah, exactly. And as I think we talked about too, is that none of the Gospels actually met Jesus, and none of the names that are attributed to the books that are written were written by those people. We don't know who wrote them.
It's all secondhand accounts. And obviously oral tradition was the thing at the time, and the population at that time as well. This is an Iron Age book. So 2,000 years ago, in that part of the world, there was maybe 10% of the population was literate.
Yes.
And so oral tradition was the way things went. But, there's clear evidence in the Bible, too, of things that are exaggerated over time or embellished over time, or certain literary devices to put people in certain situations. An example is they have Mary and Joseph travel a long, long distance, several days worth probably, to go to Bethlehem, because that is their ancestral home. And it seems to be a literary device to get Jesus to be born in Bethlehem to fulfill the prophecy in Micah, which says that the Messiah will come from Bethlehem. And the way they do that is with a census that they supposedly have to travel to their ancestral home, except for the fact that if we look back in history at any other Roman era census, nobody ever had to travel to their ancestral homes 1,000 miles or something like that, which would just be ridiculous. So there's like this weird exception that pops up that doesn't seem in line with anything else we know from history. And so it just seems like a sneaky little literary device to sort of connect the dots. And what do you know? The Messiah was born in Bethlehem and that fulfilled the prophecy.
Perfectly lines up. Yeah, it's like a movie plot. Also, Romans, another point I was going to make is that Romans at the time of Jesus talked about their leaders and kings, that they could become gods and deities, even though they were human. So I have this in front of me. It says, in ancient Rome, it was a widely accepted belief that mortal leaders, particularly emperors, could ascend to divine status and be venerated as gods. This concept, known as imperial apotheosis, was deeply rooted in Roman religion and politics. The practice symbolized both reverence for authority and the integration of political power with religious legitimacy, reinforcing the emperor's role as a figure of supreme importance in Roman society. But it kind of gives context that people at the time were talking about how humans could be gods, and so that was just a thing in their society at the time. So it's easy to assume that the same could have been done for Jesus. My question to anyone that says they believe in God is, well, what is your definition of God? Because my reaction might depend on what they would say, because saying you believe in the God of the Bible is very different from just believing in, calling the universe God or a being who put things into existence that we don't know much about.
Right. In order for God to put the universe into existence, God has to be all-powerful, exist outside of space and time, and be eternal. But then you could say, well, what if the universe itself is just eternal?
Right.
And so I don't have a problem with people saying they believe in God, although I don't feel that they can demonstrate that in any sort of meaningful way. Saying God is one thing, but then attributing it to God, and then attributing it to the God of this particular religion, and then probably going a step further and attributing it to your specific denomination or interpretation of God in that setting.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like we talked about, just being able to say, I don't know. I'm comfortable saying I don't know. And I will readily admit right now that I do not have all the answers. I do not have life figured out, and I could be wrong on all of this. But I'm pretty convinced that the Iron Age book that is the Bible is not really relevant in our society and is problematic on many levels, as we talked about historically, scientifically, and morally. As I've also mentioned, I've heard some of the best arguments from apologists, and I don't believe any of those explanations are good explanations. And I would encourage people that are Christian to read your Bible and read it critically and be open-minded to maybe having some of your ideas, your preconceived ideas or presuppositions changed.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the thing is, we're coming from a place of saying we don't know, but we're pretty sure that it's not this, this, and this based on this, this, and this.
That's exactly my point. I'm not claiming to know what is, but I'm pretty sure that any major religion that's proposed a God, I don't feel any of them are correct or that any of them have the answers. So I reject all the premises, all of the ideas of any God that's been brought forth.
Yeah, as we talked about, science works in the other way. It's by what you can measure and what you can observe and study repeatedly and try to disprove, that theory or whatever it is through peer review. It's what we can know. It's not what we we don't know, so let's put God in the middle of that. Just sounds good. I feel like, I know it's maybe cliche to say, but it's easy to see how Saint Nick existed, but Santa Claus is obviously a made up story. I could see the same happening for Jesus. Maybe there was someone named Jesus who did similar things, but I think the story has probably become a myth and legend over time, and things have been added to it and attributed to him that weren't true.
Absolutely. And some people think that the Bible is a history book, and we talked about how the Bible has many different literary styles, and there's many things like poetry and prophecy and wisdom literature and revenge fantasy and all these things, but the one thing it's definitely not is a history book. So I believe it does have kernels of truth, like naming a person or a place or a city or something like that isn't proof that everything that happened beyond that is true. Just like if I said that Spider-Man lived in New York obviously exists, but Spider-Man doesn't. And so I think with the Bible, there's things that were true and did happen, certain events, certain battles, all that kind of stuff. I just don't believe any of the supernatural claims of the Bible. When certain things start breaking down, I think some people have cognitive dissonance with it, where they have two conflicting ideas in their head. They realize slavery is not good. It never will be good. It never was good. So the fact that you're told how to treat your slaves and that you can do this and have them as inheritance is clearly wrong. It doesn't matter what the practice was at the time. It's always going to be wrong to commit genocide and destroy an entire group of people. There's no excuse for that stuff. And so I think once you start questioning those things, then it really starts falling like dominoes.
The whole thing crumbles apart. And we're just in 3 episodes. We're trying to break it down in a short amount of time, but it all adds up. We have our personal bad experiences in cult-like churches and settings and abuse that happened. And then we have the Bible itself, which falls apart under scrutiny. So it's kind of the whole thing, right? It's not just it was the people that turned us away, or it was just the Bible. It's kind of the whole package.
Right. And I think there are a lot of great Christians, but I think they're great people in spite of their religion, in spite of the fact that they're Christian.
Yes.
And that was another thing too. That was another big factor in my deconstruction was I had been traveling around the world and going on various adventures and meeting amazing people all over the world that all had very different beliefs. For example, a lot of my good friends in India are amazing people with amazing hearts. And these are people that probably live more in line to the teachings of Jesus Christ than the vast majority of any Christian I grew up with. And I was supposed to somehow believe that these people were going to get sent to hell and burn for eternity for simply choosing the wrong God. And so that was like a really big eye-opener for me. I was like, if that's the case, if there is a God and he doesn't judge you based on your heart and your intentions, and instead is more worried about whether or not you believed a guy died for your sins 2,000 years ago, that doesn't seem fair. And so I can't accept that.
Yeah, exactly. And I was just going to say, how many people in the world and what percentages are Christians and what percentage are not? And all those people are wrong and bad and going to go to hell?
Yeah. About a quarter of the world's population is Christian. So that means the vast majority, 3/4 roughly, of the world's population is hellbound. And if that was a classroom situation and only 25% are graduating, that doesn't reflect very well on the teacher.
Yeah, the teacher being God. But also, I think you made a great point about just, there's really good people in the world. Some of those are Christians, some of those are atheists, some of those are Muslims, some of those are whatever. And then there's some bad people that are also Christian and also any of the other ones, So are they just a good person? I don't care what religion they are. Are they a good person?
Yep. After deconstructing, I consider myself a secular humanist. And I feel like now that I've deconstructed, I feel like I'm a more empathetic person and I'm a less judgmental person than I ever was when I was a practicing Christian. And I feel like living a moral life, I don't think that God is necessary for a moral life. I think that a moral life is defined by actions that promote the well-being of others and reduce harm. And there's no dogma or religion needed for that.
Well, don't force it on other people. That's the key. But I agree. And I think those things people argue that those morals come from religion. I disagree. I think that's just inherent as human beings. There's just things that we know and we have learned over time. And I think empathy is the best part of being human.
I agree. It took a long time to catch up in a lot of areas of my life. Some of the best ways of countering that was through travel. So just being introduced to different cultures and learning about different cultures and showing interest in different cultures and meeting people from all walks of life. And there's a Mark Twain quote that came to mind that I would like to share. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime.
Yeah, I think that's great.
But some of the methods and strategies used to process the trauma and heal, the importance of mindfulness for me, I feel like mindfulness, and I do that through a tea practice, and it just helps me slow down and appreciate what's right in front of me, living in the moment. I feel like mindfulness, especially in our time, in our culture, that's very fast-paced and chaotic. And I'm a guy that works full-time and is raising a toddler, so moments like that, even if it's not very long, are very critical. And in addition to that, I would say practicing self-care. So just taking care of yourself, treating yourself sometimes, and being good to yourself, being easy on yourself are all very important.
I love that. Yeah, I feel like too, I view it as a lot of Christians or people might see us as falling away from religion or leaving it behind. But I feel like I don't see it that way. I feel like I grew into my true self. I gained my own identity after leaving religion behind. And I actually was thinking for myself and became my own identity that wasn't attached to something else. And that was very freeing for me. And for me, it's speaking out is very helpful. Doing what we're doing right now with the podcast. I also have a book I have written on this subject and a documentary film that'll be releasing. So for me, it's actually making art. Art has always been therapy for me, specifically movies. And that's my way of processing things through that medium. But also just it's expelling it, getting it out of your system. Like you said, when you were thinking these things for the first time and speaking them out, how your body had a reaction. I feel like for some people, it's therapy, and therapy is absolutely wonderful. But I think for me, I love using art as a way to express yourself and heal. Because in the process, you're healing yourself, and hopefully others that connect to it are also healing.
It's definitely ignited the desire in me to want to help people whenever I can. And it makes you feel good. And I'm not helping them because of any reason. I'm not doing it because I want to try and gain salvation or look better in the eyes of a God, like I've done some sort of good deed. It's simply for the sake of helping humanity because I care about humans in general. And I don't care where people are from or what their beliefs are. I want to try and be a good human to other people so they can live their best life, because that's what we know we have. We know we have this life. So why don't we live this life to our fullest and help everybody else live their best life too?
I love that.
I would say, though, that if there is a God out there and he's all-knowing, then he would know what it would take to convince me that he exists. And so far that hasn't happened. But I'm open to having my mind changed.
And also, I always wonder why God's a he.
It's the whole idea of anthropomorphism. We've attached human emotions to a God to make him more relatable. So it's why he's God the Father, and it's why he sacrificed his son. And he has these emotions like fear and jealousy and anger and regret and all these human base emotions. It's like, why would a perfect, all-powerful God have these emotions of fear and jealousy and things like that, regret?
It's a psychological portrait of the people who wrote the book.
It is.
Misogynists who, obviously were insecure and had issues.
It's the tale as old as time. I mean, people are using this to manipulate other people. They're saying, we are the chosen ones, and we get to own slaves and have them as our property and our inheritance and pass them on to our children. And we're the number one child, God's favorite, and he's going to help us, and my God can beat up your God.
Exactly. My God's bigger and better. And we have one all-powerful God. You have multiple.
That's right. Monotheism. To put forth a question for believers, I would say, how do you know that God is real? And do you have any meaningful way to demonstrate that? Because people tend to believe things that they're told, and that's where it ends. They just believe it, and they have faith, and they're going to believe in it, and they're going to continue to believe in it. But just having faith that something is real is not good. I could have faith that the moon is made of cheese, and that's something that you can't disprove. But ultimately, where does it get you at the end of the day?
I'd say to believers, you kind of have to defend all the stuff that's in there if you're endorsing it.
Right.
I mean, you got to say, hey, God is a genocidal maniac, and he's killing innocent kids and women and judging women for, when a woman marries a man, and on our wedding night, if she doesn't bleed, because they thought back then before they learned the science of it, I think it's 40% of the time a woman will bleed on her first time. And so they would say, hey, you need to show us evidence of that, or else she can be stoned and put to death.
Right. The verse you're referring to is Deuteronomy 22, verse 20 to 21. And here's just another example of the Bible getting something scientifically, biologically wrong. and over half of those women would have been punished and killed for it. Also, all women right now are cursed with painful childbirth because Eve convinced Adam to take a bite of some fruit that was from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So she didn't even know what she was doing. They ate some fruit, and because of that, it's caused this original sin so that all females from then on for all time are experiencing painful childbirth. That's why you have painful childbirth. It was because Eve sinned.
Yeah, I think what I'm saying is you have to accept all of this stuff. You can't say, oh, Jesus in the New Testament came along and now we can just sort of excuse the Old Testament. No, God should be the same.
They want to excuse the Old Testament except for the 10 Commandments. That's also in the Old Testament. So you say, like, what do you feel about the Old Testament? We should get rid of it. There's a new covenant. So what about the 10 Commandments? Oh, that was like the best moral system for laws and morality.
But yet there's so many things, as we pointed out, I believe in episode 2, that aren't on there that should be, that are missing.
Yep. I think the only logical way you can really defend the Bible, if you know everything that it says, is you could say humans were claiming to hear the voice of God, and they were claiming this, and the things that they were being told to do that were supposedly from God were not from God. They were just from humans, and that's really the only way you can get around all that stuff.
Yeah, you got to throw it out at that point. And same with all the cherry-picked anti-homosexual sentiment or whatever else that they use to judge people and condemn them.
Indeed. There's very clear instruction on the fact that you should not eat shellfish or wear clothing of mixed fabrics. But rather than say don't own slaves, I'm going to give you instruction on how to treat your slaves just a little better. Like you can beat them with a rod, and as long as they don't die within a day or two, that's fine.
Yeah, I just want to hear people defend that stuff, because to me it's just, believing in God's one thing, but to defend, you kind of have to defend that stuff. That's what I've come to realize.
Yep. A lot of people would say that the God of the Old Testament had all these rules and stuff for the time, and there was a progressive revelation until Jesus came along. But here's Jesus saying that he came to fulfill the law. It's in Matthew 5:7 during the Sermon on the Mount. He said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And the law refers to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and the prophets refer to the writings of the Hebrew prophets. And so it emphasizes this continuity with the Jewish scriptures. And if it's the same God, if Jesus is the God of the Old Testament, again, unless he's somehow changed his morality, it doesn't really make sense.
Exactly.
Even after you deconstruct, sometimes you have these thoughts that creep into your mind sometimes like, what if? What if there is a hell? I think that's why it's so damaging. I mentioned before, teaching your kids about a literal hell is a form of phobia indoctrination that's like a mind control tactic. Phobia indoctrination is what they use to brainwash people. So I think when you reinforce these harmful ideas of a literal hell where you're going to be tortured or burned for eternity, that has lasting effects. It certainly has on me. And so there's times even after now that I've deconstructed, I'll occasionally have these thoughts like, what if there's like some truth to this and like, I am going to be burned in hell forever or whatever. And it's an irrational thought. Like I realize how silly it is now, but it's still like a thought, and it still creates this weird little anxiety, if only momentarily. You have these things that you continue to question, or these thoughts, the intrusive thoughts that continue to come up. And I feel confident in my deconstruction and deconversion. I feel like overall I'm in a better place mentally. There was a lot of anger that I had, certainly, towards individuals and stuff like that. But ultimately, I've learned to be a more empathetic person and less judgmental now that I've left all that behind.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. That's all you can hope for, is to keep growing. I mean, growing as a human being consistently through your life. And I think, was it Michelangelo who said, "I'm still learning at the age of 80? I like that quote.
Yep.
Just the idea that you never stop learning, and it's actually good to be humble and admit when you don't know something, and to constantly want to gain knowledge. And I feel like that's the problem with faith and religion, is it shuts down learning anything. It's always going to be the same thing it is, and maybe there's new interpretations, but it's never evolving or growing and changing like science does when it learns from something, or as we should.
Yeah, belief like that asserts that I've found the answer, I know what the truth is, nothing is ever going to change that or shake that. And then you have to like work backwards to try and reinforce that belief. So once you find problematic verses in the Bible, for example, you have to find ways of like, oh, maybe we just need to interpret that verse differently. Maybe it's not literal. Maybe in this instance, maybe that word they're using was mistranslated, and it's a different Greek word that means something else.
Right.
And so you start trying to find excuses for why it's going to fit your preconceived ideas of what it means. And so it's a real backwards way of working. And that's why I came to the conclusion that I could no longer do that. I was like, this doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. I don't agree with that. And so, sorry, none of that works for me anymore. I'm walking away from it.
Yeah, and I feel like I never, even as a kid, I don't remember ever, talking to God or feeling like I heard from him or that I ever really believed in it. Really, anyways, I remember I made up a story as a kid to my parents just to get some approval and attention because I knew they would like that. But that's the only instance I can think of. I'm not really concerned about it anymore. I feel like for me, I'm just gonna be the best person on this earth that I can be and be kind to others because that's what feels good to me anyways, being kind and empathetic, as you said. I don't think you can go wrong there. If I'm just a decent person and I try to do my best, which is all we're trying to do, then what's wrong with that? So I didn't believe in this thing and I'm going to go to hell for that, just for not believing in it rather than the fact that I lived a good life or try to live a good life. So I'm not worried about going to hell or being wrong about that. I feel very confident in my beliefs and open to being challenged and learning new information, but I feel good on a daily basis. I'm not worried about it. I think it's just my way of processing still is just sharing this in art form and I guess getting it out of my system because it's still in there. I think there's things that still come up where I can get triggered by something or, we still live in this society where unfortunately there's Christian nationalism is on the rise and I see that as a danger. And I think there's still a lot of problems with where we're at right now in modern Christianity. So there's things that concern me that I feel like need to be talked about. But I guess I feel like I went through that process a long time ago. So I feel like now I'm just at a point of verbalizing it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because it's part of getting out of your system is to talk about it,
Yeah, no, I think it's good to have these kind of conversations, even though they're uncomfortable. And I feel like religion is just another way to see how people are different and separate people into more groups. And it's us versus them, and we're right and they're wrong. And it's just an unnecessary barrier that gets in the way of just being decent human beings and trying to relate to other people and see other people's perspectives. I feel like there's better options. If you're looking for morality, there's better options than the Bible. And if you're looking for some sort of belief system, I feel like there's better philosophies out there.
Yeah, I guess that's my biggest problem too, now that you said that, is just feeling like I was indoctrinated and that I never got a choice because I feel like everyone should have a choice, especially with religion. It's such a big topic. And I feel like they're always trying to teach kids these Bible stories that are the worst things. They say like, oh, sex and violence is bad and, stay away from it. But then the Bible has all of that. And I feel like they're teaching kids things at a young age, really young, that they shouldn't even be learning, for one thing. But two, they're not giving them a choice to believe in it. I believe in the idea that if your son or whoever, that you can allow them to make up their own mind, teach them what's out there, and then they can make their own choice. Because then it's actually truly meaningful, because then they have their own, it's up to them. It's their own independent thought and their choice, and that's more powerful. That's all I can hope for from this, is that it's a catalyst for someone listening out there or people out there that are questioning things. Maybe they're in religion, maybe they're in Christianity, and they've been questioning things but don't have a way of expressing it, and they want to hear other viewpoints, or just to get people to think for themselves, and maybe who've been through similar experiences to us, and it's therapeutic.
Yeah, talking about the Bible and its appropriateness for children, I feel like the Bible was like a Iron Age Game of Thrones with a tribal war god.
Yes.
There's horrific stuff in there, and people say, well, it's just what happened at the time, but then there's like God saying, well, here's how you treat your slaves, and by the way, I want you to go and kill every man, woman, child, and animal in this city over here because they're bad, they're wicked, they're morally corrupt. So we need to get rid of them completely, and then we can start building a better society.
Exactly.
God revealing himself to the world, especially because all of Christianity hinges on the fact of whether or not we believe in Jesus Christ. Salvation. That is the most important. If it's true, it's the most important thing that's ever or will ever happen again. So you'd think that he would want to make it clear and leave some better clues behind as to it being true. There's no reason why God couldn't reveal himself, and we still have free will whether or not we wanted to follow in or believe God. If the God of the Bible did reveal himself to me, I would still not choose to worship or follow that God.
It shouldn't be a test, right? You could still be a God and be like, hey, I'm here. If you want to, know me and be close to me, then that's your choice. And then cool, you don't go to hell, but maybe you just have the opportunity.
Here's a quote from Sam Harris. He said, "We shouldn't be hostage to these ancient memes. We shouldn't have to figure out how to make the most out of the worst idea that anyone's ever had, which is maybe you should sacrifice your firstborn child to a being you've never seen."
Oh, that's great.
I can guarantee you that I would never sacrifice my son for any god.
Yeah, and nor would I. And to me, that really encapsulates the essence of the issue to me. It kind of underscores why religion isn't necessary, and in most cases, I think can do more harm than good. I think a person can possess a strong sense of morality without relying on religion, or the restrictive dogma that comes with it, without contorting yourself and twisting yourself into a pretzel to defend the contradictions of ancient texts, especially when they endorse practices like slavery, which are morally indefensible, as we said. This is why we've distanced ourselves, not just because the narratives are illogical, but because we no longer subscribe to most of them. What I believe in is simply being a good human being, and that is entirely possible without the framework of religion. Empathy, compassion, and caring for your fellow neighbors and people, not just in your country, I would like to add, but in the world in general. There's this sort of a divided aspect of the way people view others around them, and it should be a global view, in my opinion, to care for all people on the planet, to care for all animals, for the environment, for life itself. And to me, that's actually should be very Christian, right? If God created the planet and the earth and all the things on it, we should be taking care of it. And to me, it's almost more Christian to be like that. So that's how I feel. And I hope that podcasts like this will help others to be able to open up themselves. And you can just be a good person. You don't need religion. That's what I have to say.
Yeah, well said. And I concur.
Thanks again for joining us. This has been Exodus Brothers. I'm Micah and Knapp.
And I'm Jake Knapp. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, also, if you liked this 3-part series and you want to hear more, let us know. We're considering doing more, bringing on other people, interviewing them that have had experiences, name people, and we want to just keep the conversation going and see what interest is out there for it.
You can email us at exodusbrospodcast@gmail.com. And we would love to hear if you have any of your own experience, if you've deconstructed, if you're thinking about deconstructing, if you're currently going through it, or if you have any questions for us or anything you'd like to know more of, please send us an email.
If you enjoyed this podcast and want to share it with others, please do so. We would greatly appreciate it.
Until next time, goodbye.